The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
So I think what's interesting here in the comparison is that, we have quite different approaches, but in what ways are these two documents, are these two pieces, these two readings dealing with, similar kinds of questions, or are they? I mean, obviously, they come from different sources. What about the sources, the people who wrote, or the cultures that produced, if you will, these two different, Genesis itself? What kind of culture would produce Genesis, and what kind of culture would produce the physics? Any inkling of that?
I think more like the physics has to do with questioning, and Genesis has to do more with believing, right? Like just going along with something. Whereas, like, I'm pretty sure Aristotle, being a pretty smart man, has considered a lot of different scenarios and then finally settled upon his conclusion. Whereas, like the Genesis, there's no clear evidence for that. Yeah.
What are they talking about in common? What is the sort of common background that they're both both these pieces are trying to grapple with? What are they trying to understand? Yeah.
Perhaps they're both trying to find out how things came to be. Like Charles said, Aristotle uses more rational methods of doing it, although those rational methods may not be true.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good start. But Charles said something interesting. He said in the Bible you sort of just get told what happened, and it's an origination story. It's a story about origins, is it not? It's the birth of nature, if you will. I mean, how did nature come into existence? The world in which we live in. All the creatures, I mean, this is about the emergence of the natural world as taken from a perspective, and we'll come back to that. Is Aristotle about the origins of the natural world? What is Aristotle trying to puzzle out? Yeah.
He's concerned more with like the progression of the natural world. That's like, I guess, goals, like advancement towards instead of like.
Yeah, he's more interested in what is the natural world. What is, how do we identify it, describe it, and not so much how did it come into existence, but how does it operate. He's not really that focused on, how did this thing get created in the first place. He's much more interested in how does this realm, and both of these works are trying to give us a sense of the natural world. But Aristotle's really trying to say, how do we understand the natural world? How does it work? Yeah.
One kind of conflict I have with both of these pieces is that, so in Genesis, we human beings, read this and we ascribe something that happens to us to God, or in Aristotle's case, to some ideal form. Like if we take the wall example we were looking at, it's like so you've got a wall. It's this platonic plane, whatever, that's all great, but it's not a plane that keeps you safe, that keeps you warm. I mean, the world is made out of real things, and attributing it to a platonic form or a divine being seems, at least to me, to kind of miss the whole point of it's funny to me that so many people throughout history attribute things to ideas or to divine beings, and yet the only thing that actually makes real things work are materials and construction, real forms and real matter. So I just
Yeah, no, that's a valid point. Yeah, of course, there are lots and lots of ink has been devoted to, how did the world come into existence, and why, where is it, who made it, and as you say, that doesn't really. So, what about the Bible? What about this story of Genesis? What kind of culture would produce this sort of piece, which says, in the beginning of creation, when God made heaven and earth, the earth was without form and void, with darkness over the face of the abyss, and the mighty wind that swept over the surface of the waters. God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And he separated light from darkness. And he called the light day and the darkness night. So evening came and morning came the first day. I mean, it's a beautiful passage, really. I mean, if you contemplate this piece, the prose is beautiful, but we come back, what's happening here? Why was this written? And what kind of, so I come back to my original question, what kind of culture, as you go down through this account, would produce this?
It seems like conceptually it's very simple, and in my mind, when I think back to that, since like the beginning of man, when they were all just like hunting and gathering cultures, I'm sure, there's tons of origin stories and different cultures and different forms, and it seems like this at its beginning may have been sort of a unification, like one culture of scholars stood up and said we should unite these people's beliefs, and at its core, this is how it began, and something simple as light and darkness and things like that.
Yeah, the certainly at some pragmatic level, this was recorded, and it was recorded as the wisdom of the ages, and became the first chapter of Genesis. We don't have an author. We don't know who wrote it. And in fact, it's believed by many people to have been written by God himself, or herself, or itself. I mean, depending on your views of God. But and that this was sort of a account that was inspired through, a kind of sacred inspiration. It was an account. But if you read a little more closely and you see the concerns and the ways in which the different observations are made in this piece, what is the author concerned about? What are some of the things the author is concerned about?
I think today, if we ask the question, where do we come from, why are we here, we have so many things that we can reference. Like, we can go to the Bible, we can go to Aristotle, we can take this class and discuss so many different sources. But back when the Bible was written, there may not have been anything to reference as like, where did we come from? So a culture may have just felt that it was their responsibility, or like they just felt as though they needed to have some type of explanation. And it's pretty simple. It's something that anybody living could observe, that light comes and night comes. So maybe they were just trying to give them, like, provide themselves with an explanation. Or that to future generations. Just because when, I don't know, maybe just because as MIT students, like we tend to try to look for answers, and I think a lot of people have a tendency to do that, and like after people stopped doing hunting and gathering and had a little more free time on their hands, like what exactly are we doing here? So
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. This is, the product of, somebody had some extra time. Yeah. I mean, if you're trying to just survive the day, you don't have time for this. But
the culture which gave rise to such a story did have references to refer to, but perhaps there were multiple and not agreeing with each other. And so, getting back to his point, the story was perhaps made as a unification of all those references, perhaps emerging from tribal histories, in which each tribe had its own story of creation.
yeah.
What your original question was about, what it was focusing on. I remember one of the recurring words or ideas was seeds and food and things like that, and that I'm granting you these seeds and I'm granting you this food and I'm granting you this land and things like that. I mean, that was definitely an important concept when they moved from hunting gathering to early agriculture.
Tremendous, yeah. I mean, these are so. This is not a hunter-gatherer society that produced this account. It's a society you can tell just from a culture, just from reading it, that there was a level of stability there, a level of understanding of the surroundings. A not unsophisticated view of the progression of things. I mean, one word that recurs over and over in this account is kind, according to its kind. What are they referring to? Why is that? So it says, it says, God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kind. Cattle, reptiles, wild animals, all according to their kind. It says it twice. And that word kind comes so, what's this?
Talking about species
Yeah, maybe species is a little too. That word comes in quite a bit later, a little later. I mean, Aristotle's already thinking in these terms too. But, yeah, they're thinking, I mean, they know that kind reproduces kind. And that this is a kind of a rule. I mean, we're a little bit like, I hesitate to say this, but, Alice in Wonderland, trying to find the rules. How do things work? What is the impulse to describe? What is the impulse to understand how things came in? It's here. There's a desire to understand how the world came into existence. And we were reading Genesis here. I didn't take it just because of the Christian reference, but simply because it's such a available text. I mean, we have Hopi, we have, I'm sure Buddhism has accounts of the world in which, how the world came into existence. In your syllabus, I showed you a Hindu version of the creation of worlds. Many cultures have gone through the same set of questions and come up with accounts. Yeah.
So I think by putting things in, by organizing things by kind, basically it's following the idea that everything needs to be in order, right? So I feel like throughout here you could see God parting light and dark, and then parting heaven and earth, and so it's almost like a grid work. Everything's ordered, and then now he's introducing all these different things that could be variables, but no, they have to be together. And so it's kind of like you have to. It's kind of like a sense that you have to know your place. Right? Things belong somewhere. You belong to your people, and you are a person. You're not God. Everything is ordered. There's no room for chaos in this creation story.
Okay, yeah. Certainly at the start, it's it's a perfect creation. Things happen in the next chapter that don't necessarily go so well, but certainly the origin here is this is an ordered world. This is a account that gives a sense of the order of the world, the stability of the world, the fact that we're not living in an arbitrary setting, but that there's this kind of hierarchy of things. At the very top is God, And all the way down through the creation are kinds that exist. And even the way in which the account sort of sorts through the coming into existence of things. Is there any logic here?
I'm actually confused. Are you implying, are you saying that there is a hierarchy or there isn't? Because it seems like if each according to its kind of implies disjoint groups of things, which couldn't be ordered in any particular way, but obviously in nature, when you go out and look, you can see that the duck is like the goose is like the
Right, yeah.
So.
No, what I'm saying is that there's a hierarchy. Humans are over the creation. Certain things came before other things, and God is over everything. So, there's a series of levels in this account that sort of suggests that there's a ultimate order. I'm not saying that, this is necessarily what everybody believes, but I'm saying this is how this particular account is trying to bring order.
What does the order represent?
Good question. What?
I don't know.
Anybody?
I think in a way it represents purpose. And at least I think at the end of it, it's like a human and God-centric world that's been created.
Yeah.
And so then the hierarchy is, man's use of everything, whether it's the plants and animals to eat or to domesticate or things like that.
Yeah,
The world is created for the human.
I think that's a good answer, actually. Purpose. It represents, what does it represent? It represents a purposive world, a world that shows purpose. And why? What is it about purpose that humans are constantly trying to understand? I mean, aren't we still trying to figure out what the order of things is? I mean, don't we in some way connect to these, obviously this is a product of an agricultural society that, everything is important in terms of, the plants and the animals and the night and the day and so forth. Probably a very, very early agricultural society. And it, Mesopotamian and it was the product of the curiosity and the attempt to understand what the purpose of things is. But also an effort to understand what the order of things is. And in that respect, we share. Even in, what are we trying to do at MIT? We're trying to figure out the order of things. I mean, we're constantly probing into the natural world to understand how things are related to other things. And in this respect, we share this common curiosity and quest, if you will, for a sense of order. Now, we may be disappointed a lot, but and we don't ultimately understand. But the point I'm trying to make here is this effort is something that Darwin himself partook of. Why did Darwin spend vast amounts of effort to try to understand the emergence of organic beings and the relationship of those processes to the changes in the geological structure, the geological surface of the Earth? I mean, there's a commonality of quest here. Now, the resources available to an early agricultural culture were not great. I mean, simple farmers, people of a certain faith or certain view, and they recorded their views. It's a sign that there was some degree of leisure in the culture in which people could reflect on the surroundings around them. This is not to say that people who were before these eras did not undertake the same understanding of their surroundings. I expect that hunter-gatherers had a vast store of information about their surroundings and how they worked and so on and so forth. But here we have an effort to sort of put it into a creation account. Are there any other things that are there any other social, cultural, spiritual, if you wish, uses to an account like this?
Well, I think that might not necessarily need like leisure time in order to think about these things. I guess if you think about it, there are plenty of opportunities for people who are overstressed, like a long time ago. Maybe like things aren't going well for them, they're not catching whatever they're trying to catch, and then they question, why does life suck? And then so they start to like, why is this happening to me? And then like they need a reason for that, and maybe like some really wise guy in the tribe comes over and they're like, oh, this is how, this is why, and it's meant to be. And you have to write out this like whatever period. And so like I don't think like you you really need like leisure time to start thinking about the whys of our world. Yeah, but certainly leisure time does help.
But I think the important distinction is that you need the leisure time to write it down. Because the hunter-gatherer cultures were like, had oral tradition. And so, you know, it wasn't until, you know, the people had settled that someone could actually take weeks of their life and write things down.
Yeah, I mean, probably these emerged out of oral traditions. I mean, you know, these didn't probably just get, you know, some person decided, oh, I'm going to write this really interesting account, and, you know, scratch it out in some form of, I mean, most of these are things that have emerged out of long cultural histories. You know, so, but, you know, I think they identify a fundamental quest of humans, which is to understand their surroundings. And whether or not you agree with Genesis or is not the point here. It's really the understanding of this profound need that, you know, we still feel today. I mean, and Darwin felt, I mean, Darwin was a great understander and reader of biblical texts. I mean, he was a Cambridge undergraduate. He had to study, you know, natural theology and, you know, the origins of the world. So, you know, Darwin knew his biblical sources. I'm not sure he gained much from them, but he did gain a sense of the order. And if you look at the order here, the start with the light and the day, the separation of the heavens, the formation of the land and the seas, the heavenly bodies. Some of these are out of order, but there is a kind of a order of emergence here. And there have been people who actually age theorists who are biblical scholars and people who have great interest in trying to figure out how to interpret the Bible literally, who say, well, Genesis, every day actually represents a millennium, and, you know, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. And so, you know, they have interpretations that sort of expand these. I mean, it's curious. I've given you a couple of them in the URLs for if you're interested in this. I mean, it's amazing how ingenious people have been with the original Bible account. But it was really the dominant view of the world at Darwin's time. I mean, I'm not just throwing this in here as, I mean, this is the dominant view that, I don't know what percentage, the vast majority of Darwin's contemporaries held of the origin of the earth, origin of the world.
But, I mean, it mentions God creating heaven and the earth. There's no mention of anything else being created. So,
yeah.
I kind of, I mean, I guess if there is the question of whether or not God itself was the author, I would find that like difficult to believe, I guess, because there's so much else out there, and there's no mention of the creation of any of that. And if something or somebody had to create us, I don't think just the rest of the universe spontaneously was created. But it's interesting if people do interpret that, like, the omnipotent
Well,
person. Like,
I mean, we're bringing, and this is fine. We're bringing our own understandings. I mean, there was no universe for the people. I mean, there was no concept
no,
of.
just in like retrospect. I
Yeah,
guess,
yeah.
Trying to figure out who wrote it. I think the idea that God himself or herself.
Well, there are lots of different theories, but probably one of the dominant theories is that it was a God-inspired scribe who was basically putting down the account from the inspiration, divine inspiration. This is seen by people of the book as divinely inspired texts.
Yeah, I guess that's just hard to grasp if there's no mention of everything else in its creation.
Yeah. Well, it's
Just for
there are a lot of missing parts. There's no doubt about it.
Because of stars in the sky.
Yeah.
That's the universe.
Yeah, no,
it
it's.
does mention
I mean, if you want to do a close analysis here, a lot of things, day and night are occurring before the actual moon and the sun and so forth. But even so, if you look at it, there is a kind of a order that somebody who is generous would say, for a first draft, it's not too bad. I mean, 3,000 years ago, these are people who have no benefits of sort of the insights that many of us take for granted. So we're just trying to understand, what is the baseline for the things that Darwin was dealing with. And certainly this is a huge baseline. I mean, most people really did literally believe this account as the origin of the world. And this became very difficult in Darwin's time for scientists, because a geologist could go out and figure out, hey, this column here is at least 1 million years old, or so many 100,000 years old, and here are people who were positing the creation of the earth, between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. So things were sort of getting out of whack in Darwin's time, because people who understood the geological structure of the world and the dynamics of geology could see, there's no way that account could be accurate. Then, of course, you can say, well, it's, and many people do, and I don't have any problem with this myself, that, this is an account that isn't meant to be literal. It's meant to sort of create a sense of the emergence of the world over through the intercession of God. So anyway, so let's any other observation? I mean, books have been written on Genesis, so I don't purport here to give any thorough account of it, but I'm interested in kind of orienting us for our readings, because as we read in cultural history, we need to be conversant with what the general understandings of things were at the time. Because if we want to understand Darwin, we have to be part historians in order to understand the times of his work and the culture in which he lived and breathed. And Darwin was married to a very pious woman who read her Bible every day. And one of Darwin's great concerns was, what are my ideas going to, how are they going to, potentially undermine my own family's views and faith? Darwin really worried about these things. So, okay, so now we come from this account, which Charles mentioned as sort of we're being told what happened count, and now we're over in Aristotle. So what's the difference with the Aristotelian? Aristotle was a great philosopher, a great Greek philosopher, and he was a student of Plato, and and he's famous as partly as the tutor of Alexander. He was a prolific author, one of the greatest authors of the ancient world. He wrote on. He was like a figure like a Leonardo, just this character who just worked across. I don't think he produced artworks, although who knows. But you know, he produced vast amounts of work that was often, almost always based on very, very careful, shrewd observation. So he's one of the great figures. And Aristotle's works, when they were translated into Latin and they entered into the European cultures, Aristotle survived all the way into the medieval era. He was really the great figure of the ancient world for science and biology. I mean, there were many others, but Aristotle was just this kind of massive producer of work. And, you know, this is just book 2 from his physics. And the reason I've selected it is because it does deal with his effort to understand the natural world and his effort to set down some, if you will, rules. I mean, I suppose if Alice grew up in Wonderland and had a chance and wanted to be a philosopher, she would have had to come up with a book of rules. I mean, you're living in an environment and you're trying to understand your environment, and certain people sort of just accept things as they are and say, well, things are the way they are because that's how God made them. But there are other minds that say, you know, let's get a little closer to observation and try to understand these things in a little more orderly fashion. So what can you say about the difference in the approach of Aristotle? Is there any reason? Yeah.
It's very rigorous.
I agree with that. I think he's you know, he may be wrong. We may think he's wrong on 1 or 2 points or something, but the rigor is there. And how is it expressed? Why is it rigorous?
Because it's laid out as a set of rules. He has the 4 causes, and it's not, so it's not just arbitrary.
No.
It says they have to satisfy this, 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 and this.
Mm-hmm. So he's got his 4 causes. He says, in order to understand an object or a thing, you must understand it in these 4 different perspectives. And he starts his work first by, how does he start out with this work? I mean, if Genesis starts out by saying, well, God created the night and the day and so on and so forth, how does Aristotle start out? Aristotle is not, as I said before, he's not going to go into the whole question of origins. How did, you know, the why, how did this come into existence? And in this respect, again, I refer forward to Darwin all the time because I want you to connect these works, even if very remotely. Darwin wasn't worried about, Darwin didn't talk about origin. I mean, origin of species is in some sense slightly misleading title. Because Darwin doesn't really, he has origin in the title, but he's not really interested in, you know, how did creation, you know, how did life get created? I mean, this is not Darwin's question. I mean, he throws out a couple of guesses toward the end of the book, but you know, he's really much more interested in what are the mechanisms. So Aristotle starts out by doing what? differentiating between nature. What is nature? What are we referring to when we use this word nature? How can we characterize it? And then art, the things that are produced by humans. So he has this big division. Nature, and what is nature? He says, what is meant by nature, anything may be said to have a nature so far as it possesses within itself a principle. I think that's nature basically possesses the principle for what? Its own formation. Nature forms itself. So the concept of nature is that which exists by virtue of its own production or its own principles. So anything which, nothing in this room is nature. Everything in this room is produced by humans. Well, I suppose oxygen, and there are a few things we could get nature, and that would be an interesting exercise. You know, what elements that we would associate with nature exist in a room like this, and I suppose we could come up with a lot of them when we start getting into microbiology and all the different and ourselves. I mean, we are here. And then he has techne and the concept of things that are made through artifice, oftentimes in imitation of nature. So he makes this big distinction, and that turns out to be a key framework for this piece of analysis. Okay. By the way, did everybody get a copy of this? Because I passed this out. I mean, if you didn't have, if any of you, you can pass those around if anybody needs some. Okay, so then he moves into his more extensive analysis. And he talks here on page 25 of the 4 types of explanation. Before I go into that, I did want to say something about this Aristotelian concept of nature. And I would suggest that this is very much the product of an urban society. Why do I say that? This work, the product of urban society.
Because of the leisure factor. Every different people in like different parts of one society, they're assigned like division of labor, and so everything is taken care of, leaving some people time to think.
Okay, that's part of it.
There's so much human design surrounding the people.
Yeah. I mean, this is full of stuff, understandings of techniques and art, and I mean, this is not something that people sort of trying to make it through, you know, the drought. I mean, this is a product of fairly extensive discussion and probing, the sort of thing that you would expect really in a much more a much wealthier society. With I mean, the society Aristotle lived in was had lots and lots of hierarchies, had slave labor, it had all sorts of things. I mean, it was a big enterprise. And this kind of knowledge, as you can see as you just read the work, it's just full of references, and you think, you know, how does he know that? Wow. He knows about technique, he knows about building, he knows about all these different structures. So it just kind of oozes out of the text. that this is, you know, okay. And somebody used the word rigorous. This is a fairly sophisticated approach to knowledge, wouldn't you agree? I mean, you read a textbook, you get your chemistry text, whatever, and you know, the first thing it starts to go is, you know, what's the terminology? How are we going to talk about this stuff? What are the big categories? And then you start moving down into the principles and operations. It's happening here. I mean, yeah, we can pick arguments with them all over the place, but the structure here is a fundamental structure for the generation of knowledge. This is not something that is written to just get itself repeated. This is something that is written to provide us an avenue into discovery. So, you know, when he lays down his different principles, the causes, sorry about this, but this was a very good, I sent this out to you all. So I don't know if you're getting my emails. I hope you are. But so when he lays down these causes, he's really interested in discovering a method for discovery. I mean, these are general principles that are supposed to guide you. Do they have any validity today? What about material cause?
What things are made of.
Yeah, I mean, we have a big department of material science here, just in case you don't know. I mean, we are studying materials still. And he identifies as one of the phenomena of natural phenomena we want to know about is material cause. So everything exists in virtue of its material, and we take this approach. I'm not saying we're Aristotelians anymore, but I am saying he identified some pretty important categories for what we would call physics, what he called physics, which was the understanding of the physical world. Formal cause, forms. What about that? Every object has some kind of pattern or form. Yes?
I feel that's, you know, very relevant today because the whole idea of form and function in science, and so it's definitely
form is something we pay incredibly close attention to. Forms sometimes are what produce certain phenomena. And so the formal aspects of things. And just think of the story of the double helix and the discovery of the double helix and how important those photographs were to trying to put together the concept of the original material of life, and how form played such a big role in that. Think of how we try to understand form in large scale cosmology, you know, the Hubble telescope, and you know how we try to study the form of the universe. We study form all the way up and down the scale of existence, and we get tremendous amounts of information just by understanding form. So again, efficient cause, the agent or force that bring things into existence or change things, the dynamics of things. We're constantly trying to understand dynamics. Think of Newton's Principia and the way in which Newton created an understanding of gravitational force through an understanding of motion. And Einstein later added some pretty important corrections, again through the study of motion. You know, the famous study of the train going down the track and the changing sound and so forth. I mean, so motion, we are constantly obsessed with motion, the dynamics of things. So again, here's a guy writing, before the time of Christian era, and he's already setting out these categories. Yeah.
Can I just ask where the label efficient cause came from? Because in the reading it's called propelling factor.
Yeah, it's used, the translations give different so it'll depend, because it's originally in Greek.
Right.
And so the interpreter, sometimes people, there are a lot of scholars of Aristotle, and I am not one of them. And so, but I know there are there are many people who have very precise understandings of Aristotelian categories and so forth, and what they represent, what they don't represent. But in many translations you get efficient cause, but you can also get propelling, in that particular translation you're referring to, it's factor. So factor and cause get changed around. But I think the causes are the most widely used terminology I found for Aristotle. And then finally there's this last category, which is a tricky one, the final cause. So what's that all about? Final cause. How is that different from the other causes? The others are sort of passive, are they not? They're just, the material is there, the form is there, and the behavior is there. But it's kind of, but now we come into this new cause, the final cause. That is the purpose.
And that's really debatable.
Well, that's where we come into some ambiguities, yeah. So what is the purpose of the horse? As you said, well, it's to be a horse.
But it could be to be transportation, or it could be to inhabit the plains of,
Yeah. So
and a house, you could say, is meant to provide shelter, but then it could be like to make somewhere look some houses, they're way too big and way too fancy for anybody to really live in and use everything. Yeah, exactly. So
it's very hard to tie purpose down, because purpose is a sort of an abstract concept. Now we can say, well, okay, in design, we return to that word design. The adaptation, as I mentioned, the quickest definition of design is the adaptation of means to ends. The end is the purpose. So where does purpose enter in? And why is purpose? Purpose is a bit of a problem in natural phenomena, is it not? It's not in artifice. We have purposes for the things we make. The artist has a purpose in creating the great work of art. The bridge builder has a purpose in building the bridge. The purpose, we can ascribe purposes to human behavior. But when we try to ascribe it to natural things, we get into problems, don't we? And of course, Darwin came up with it. This is called teleology. The telic factor. Some people call the final cause the telic factor. Does anybody know what the word T-E-L-I-C, or the word is teleology, T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-Y, teleology. Have you ever come across that word?
Well, it comes from telos, and telos means end. So in biology, you learn the telomeres. They're at the ends of the chromosomes.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's how.
And they get shorter and shorter each time. And that is how.
That's a different use of that. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So teleology is a very big word, and Darwin had to confront this because, he is trying to describe a very complicated system that has come into existence that in his framework of analysis did not have any ultimate purpose. And of course, a lot of the people who thought of the world as a very purposive place, i.e. referring back to the Bible, which is in Genesis, there is a purpose. The greater glory and understanding of God. And, you can put it in your own terms, but there's an ultimate purpose there. A lot of people do not feel comfortable with the notion that the world may be utterly purposeless. Why is this a problem? Do you like to think of the world you live in as purposeless?
Yeah, it's certainly not good for morale.
It can get it can make you it can lead to depression.
On a scalar view, though, sometimes it seems like it almost is, especially in physics when we talk about the entire universe, and just there was something. It was like a map, and it zoomed in on some people who were in a pool, and then it zoomed out, and it was each time it was 10 to the n meters that it went out, and it just went out so far, and it got into pictures of different galaxies, and then eventually it zoomed in, and it had to zoom in so many times just to get back to those two people. And it does make you question, is there really a reason why people are sitting in pools? No.
It's the big question.
That a lot of people, people struggle with this, because it's not comforting. It's not comforting to think that there is no ultimate purpose to things. And I forget I should know who this is, but somebody said the more we know about nature, the more pointless it all seems. I'm not here to sell any particular philosophy, but you need to grapple with some of these deep questions when you try to understand the evolutionary world that Darwin lived in and created and occupied. What was in his mind? And the notion, Einstein once said, God doesn't roll dice. There are a lot of people who have grappled with this question over the ages. It's a profound human question. And it goes back to Charles's point that, there is something noble and grand about the Bible, because it attempts to bring purpose into the human world. On the other hand, when you're looking at a world that is scientific, as Darwin was, that's just not the question. He doesn't have anything to gain from that. He's trying to create and understand a system that will operate and provide explanations. I'm sorry, you were here.
From a scientific standpoint, actually more like a physics standpoint, there really is no purpose to anything in this entire universe, because on the very fundamental scale, everything is just a manifestation of very key interactions between distinct particles. And so everything, if you consider everything to have grown out of a proton attracting an electron and basically so on and so forth, then you wonder why we even care why we're here. If all that all the thoughts that we're going through are just neurons firing electric signals and stuff like that, that is fundamentally physical, right? So I guess it's just a existential crisis for some people, and I've certainly been through a phase like that where I wonder what's the meaning, if I'm just an aggregate of biological molecules that just work really well together. And I think that, so if you wanted to talk about the creator of the universe, then all he really had to do was dump a bunch of particles, put a lot of energy in it, let different things behave differently, and then by virtue of their differences and energy that propels them, they will grow into all of these things. And like, just for example, on like human scale, if you pick one person who's really shy, so that's one characteristic, and you pick someone who's like really outgoing and you stuff them in one room, after a while you'll see something happen, and it's not because you did something to make that happen, you just put them there. And they interacted.
Hey, gravity will.
Ultimately, so. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting difference in thought in that in the Genesis style of thinking, there's no problem in it being a human-centric universe, and they don't have any problem with saying that, the purpose of the world exists so that we can discover it and we can use it, and humanity can, bend it to its will and everything. And I find it strange that the more we achieve as a society in terms of science and discovery and all this, like the greater our achievements, the more we feel this need to be humble. Like science distances humanity from the world. Like we say, this all exists outside of us. Whereas, Genesis didn't feel that humility that science like tells us we have to have. So I almost feel like what if that Genesis style of thought was more present today, where we discover all the science we're doing, look how great we are, like we don't say that anymore,
Well,
I think we've reached limits with our science, and what people often say is the more they know, the more they realize how little they know. And I think science has that deep philosophical effect on people who are true seekers, who realize that I've really got this molecule nailed, but it's brought up 50 other questions that I don't even have the vaguest idea how to solve. And so there is a kind of state of mind that comes from scientific inquiry. I would suggest that there is a kind of humility in the Genesis account, which is different, and that is just a humility before some massive force that was inexplicable. And I think certain great explicators like Einstein sort of could capture these two senses and try to bring them together at times. But at the end of the day, one belongs to one world, the world of faith, and that's the account. You either accept or you don't. And the other belongs to the world of experience, if you will. Experience in the sense of learning and expanding knowledge. And so they really come from different sources. We have time for one.
Just like on Charles's comment about just being like biological molecules put together, and like we're set out to be something and we don't really have a choice in that. We were actually talking about that the other day in my chem class, and apparently I think back when chemistry was first coming about, there were some questions about so if we can predict what every molecule and how any element is going to react, then does that mean that we have no control over our own destinies? But then once quantum mechanics came into it, it presented the idea that there's a probability that something will happen, but it's not necessarily going to happen. So I guess with the people in the room, you could put the shy person and the outgoing person in, and you would assume that eventually they would interact. But then there's a probability that maybe the shy person would just be completely overwhelmed and would go hide in the corner. So I think just as a comforting idea, we're not set out to be something necessarily. There's a probability that we might be something else.